Air hostess insults black passenger, shocked when she learns he owns the airline. Have you ever witnessed something so unjust, so blatantly wrong, that it left you speechless? Imagine this: a bustling airport, a routine flight, and an interaction so shocking that it left an entire plane of passengers questioning their own silence. But what if I told you the man at the center of it all wasn't just any passenger? What if he was someone whose mere presence could change lives? Stay with me, because this is a story you won't forget, and one that proves grace and dignity can shatter even the strongest barriers. And before we begin, let me say this: we're not just here to tell stories. We're building something bigger, a community of compassion, faith, and courage. So if you believe in standing up for what's right, join us by subscribing. Together, we're making a difference. John Davis adjusted the strap on his simple duffel bag as he made his way through the crowded airport terminal. He wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, but there was something about him that drew attention. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, calm, composed, a quiet confidence in every step. Dressed in a sharp but understated suit, John greeted everyone he passed with a polite nod or a warm smile. The gate agent, the janitor mopping the floor, the elderly woman struggling with her bag. He saw them all, and they saw him. He wasn't in a rush. He had nothing to prove. To most, he might have looked like just another traveler, blending into the sea of faces that filled the terminal. But John was anything but ordinary. As he approached the boarding area for his flight, he overheard snippets of conversations around him. Families planning their vacations, business people loudly discussing deals, and flight attendants preparing for the journey ahead. Among them was Susan, a tall, impeccably dressed air hostess whose sharp features were matched only by the sharpness of her tone. Susan wasn't unkind, not overtly. She was professional, efficient, and undeniably good at her job. But there was an edge to her demeanor, a certain air of superiority that lingered in the way she spoke to people, especially people who didn't look like they belonged. John handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who greeted him warmly before waving him through. He stepped onto the plane, his calm demeanor unchanged, and made his way to his seat in first class. It wasn't his first time flying in this section, but he didn't flaunt it. He placed his bag in the overhead compartment, settled into his seat, and opened a book, ready for the journey ahead. It didn't take long for Susan to make her presence known. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes scanned the passengers, her smile fixed and professional. But when she saw John, her expression faltered ever so slightly. She hesitated, then approached his seat. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone polite but with an unmistakable edge. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" John looked up from his book, his face calm, almost amused. "Yes, I believe I am." Susan's smile tightened. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers." There it was, not outright hostility, but something far more insidious. A question disguised as a statement, a challenge wrapped in false politeness. John reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, handing it to her without a word. Susan studied it, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Well," she said, handing it back, "enjoy your flight." She walked away, but the look on her face lingered in the air like smoke. Other passengers noticed it too. The way she had looked at him, spoken to him, as if his very presence in that seat was an anomaly. John returned to his book, unbothered on the surface, but anyone who looked closely could see the subtle shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated this way. It wouldn't be the last. The flight progressed, and Susan's behavior only became more evident. She greeted every other passenger in first class with warmth and attentiveness, offering personalized service and engaging in polite conversation. But when she passed John, her tone turned curt, her interactions limited to the bare minimum. A drink spilled on his tray, a half-hearted apology, a request for an extra napkin, a sigh and an eye roll. Passengers began to notice. A woman seated across the aisle whispered to her husband, her brow furrowed. A man 2 rows back shook his head in disbelief. But no one said anything, not yet. They all watched, waiting to see how far it would go. And through it all, John remained calm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't complain. He simply endured, his quiet dignity standing in stark contrast to Susan's behavior. But beneath that calm exterior, something was brewing. Not anger, not resentment, something far more powerful. Something that would soon change everything. Susan continued her rounds in the first-class cabin, her every move brisk and precise. To most, she seemed professional, efficient, and in control. But for those paying attention, there was an undeniable undercurrent to her actions. The warmth she offered to other passengers, a smile here, a friendly comment there, never seemed to extend to John. When it came to him, her tone cooled, her words grew clipped. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was unmistakable. A slight hesitation before addressing him, a hint of disdain in her eyes when he asked for something. If you weren't watching closely, you might have missed it. But John didn't miss it. He never did. The moment that began to shift everything happened about halfway through the flight. Susan was serving drinks, her polished smile in place as she moved from passenger to passenger. She arrived at John's row, her expression faltering for a fraction of a second before she masked it. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her tone just this side of dismissive. "Water, please," John replied, his voice calm. She poured the water, placing it on his tray table with the barest hint of care. As she turned to leave, her elbow knocked the glass, spilling water all over John's lap and his open book. A sharp gasp escaped from the passengers around them. Susan froze, her face a mix of annoyance and embarrassment. "Oh," she said flatly. "Sorry about that." John reached for the napkin she handed him, dabbing at his pants. "It's fine," he said, his tone as steady as ever. But it wasn't fine. The murmurs from nearby passengers grew louder. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stealing glances at Susan, whose demeanor had shifted further into defensive territory. "I'll get you another glass," she said tersely, before walking away without another word. The tension in the cabin was palpable. One by one, passengers began to exchange glances, silent messages passing between them. A middle-aged woman seated across the aisle leaned over to her husband, whispering, "Did you see that?" She barely even apologized. Her husband nodded, frowning. Another passenger, a younger man in a crisp suit, muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." He looked toward John, who had returned to his now wet book, his face composed but distant. As Susan returned with a new glass of water, the murmurs subsided, but the air remained heavy. She placed the glass on John's tray without meeting his eyes and hurried away. John gave a small nod, but said nothing. He wasn't here to make a scene. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to get home, to be with his family. But his silence spoke volumes. The moment that changed everything came shortly after. A woman sitting a few rows back, her voice trembling slightly, addressed Susan directly as she passed. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone firm but polite. "I think you owe that gentleman a proper apology." Susan stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I already apologized," she said, her voice defensive. "Did you?" the woman asked, her gaze unwavering. "Because it sure didn't sound like one." The cabin fell silent. Every eye turned toward Susan, who stood frozen for a moment before plastering a strained smile on her face. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am," she said tightly, "but I assure you, everything is fine." The woman didn't back down. "I'm not so sure about that, and I don't think the rest of us are either." There were murmurs of agreement from the other passengers. Susan's face reddened, and for a moment she looked as though she might argue. But then her eyes flicked to John, who sat quietly, watching the exchange without a word. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't triumphant. It was calm, almost serene, and it seemed to unnerve her more than anything else. As the murmurs subsided, Susan turned and walked briskly to the galley, avoiding further eye contact. Passengers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief. John remained silent, his composure intact, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. "Why didn't he say something?" one passenger whispered to another. "Why is he just sitting there?" "Maybe he's used to it," the other replied, their voice heavy with sadness. "Maybe this isn't new for him." And that was the truth of it. John wasn't angry because he'd been here before. He wasn't surprised because he'd seen it all before. But what Susan and everyone else didn't know was that John's silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't acceptance. It was a choice. A choice that would soon make itself clear in a way no one could have anticipated. The plane landed smoothly, a routine descent that belied the tension that had simmered in the first-class cabin throughout the flight. As passengers gathered their belongings, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. People moved quietly, some still casting glances at John, who remained seated, his demeanor as steady as ever. Susan was stationed at the front of the cabin, her expression tightly controlled as she thanked passengers for flying with them. Her eyes, however, occasionally flicked toward John, her discomfort evident. She had sensed something shift during the flight. The murmurs, the pointed looks from passengers. It was as if the entire cabin had silently judged her, and she was painfully aware of it. John stood, retrieving his bag with practiced ease. He moved with the same calm precision he had displayed throughout the flight. As he stepped into the aisle, he turned briefly, offering a quiet nod to the woman who had spoken up on his behalf earlier. She smiled back, a hint of apology in her eyes. When John reached the front of the plane, something unexpected happened. The captain, a distinguished man in his early 60s, emerged from the cockpit and extended his hand with a wide, genuine smile. "Mr. Davis," the captain said warmly, "it's always an honor to have you on board." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Susan froze, her hand gripping the edge of the service counter as the color drained from her face. Passengers stopped mid-step, their curiosity piqued. Whispers began to spread like wildfire. John shook the captain's hand, his expression still composed but now tinged with something else. A quiet authority that had gone unnoticed until now. "Thank you, Captain," he said, his voice low and steady. "I appreciate your kind words." Susan's breath hitched audibly, and she quickly tried to compose herself. Her mind raced as she replayed every interaction she'd had with John during the flight. Something was wrong, or rather, something was about to be very, very clear. The captain turned to Susan, his friendly smile unwavering. "I trust you and your team provided Mr. Davis with the excellent service he deserves." Susan stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, of course. Absolutely." The captain gave a satisfied nod and patted John on the shoulder. "Safe travels, sir, and thank you for everything you do for this airline." If the whispers had been a murmur before, now they were a full-blown chorus. Passengers leaned toward each other, their voices tinged with incredulity. "Who is he? Did he say this guy does something for the airline? Wait, does he Does he own it?" Susan's face was a mask of barely contained panic. She tried to steady herself, but the truth was sinking in like a stone. John wasn't just a first-class passenger. He wasn't just a man with a ticket. He was someone important, someone who had been watching her every move. John turned to Susan, his gaze steady but not unkind. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. She felt the weight of his eyes on her, the unspoken message in his calm expression. "It's not about who I am," John said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was measured, firm, but gentle. "It's about how we treat each other. That's what matters." Susan's composure shattered. Her mouth moved soundlessly for a moment before she finally managed to speak. I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. I didn't mean—" John held up a hand, silencing her gently. "No need to apologize to me. Just remember this moment. Treat everyone with respect, not because of who they might be, but because of who they are." The cabin was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, heavy, reflective. Passengers watched, their expressions a mix of awe and shame, as John adjusted his bag and walked off the plane. He didn't look back. Susan remained rooted to the spot, her thoughts a whirlwind of regret and self-recrimination. She glanced around at the passengers, many of whom were now openly staring at her. She felt small, exposed, and deeply ashamed. The woman who had spoken up earlier caught her eye and gave her a pointed look. Not cruel, but firm. A reminder of the accountability she couldn't escape. Susan took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. She knew this wasn't over, not for her, and she knew, deep down, that it shouldn't be. As John stepped into the terminal, the warm light of the airport greeted him, a stark contrast to the tension he had left behind. He pulled out his phone, glancing at a message from his wife. "Can't wait to see you. The kids are so excited." A small smile played at his lips. This was what mattered. Not the flight, not the treatment he had endured, but the people waiting for him at home. And as he walked away, his head held high, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed what happened that day. Not through anger, not through confrontation, but through the power of grace. Susan sat alone in the airline's break room later that day, her hands trembling as she held a cup of coffee she'd barely sipped. The events of the flight replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. Every glance, every comment, every dismissive word she had spoken to John felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. How could she have been so blind, so thoughtless? And now she knew who he was, the owner of the airline, a man whose name she had seen on company announcements and training materials. But even more than his status, what struck her was how he had carried himself. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't humiliated her in front of the passengers, though he easily could have. Instead, he had held up a mirror, forcing her to confront the ugliness of her own behavior. Her colleagues filtered in and out of the room, offering polite hellos, but Susan barely noticed. She was lost in thought, questioning everything she had believed about herself. She prided herself on being professional, capable, and efficient. But today had revealed something else, something she didn't want to see. Later, during her shift debrief, her supervisor approached her. He was a kind man, always willing to listen, but there was a seriousness in his eyes now. "Susan," he said, his tone firm but not unkind, "I need to talk to you about the flight today." She felt her stomach drop. Of course, it wasn't over. Word had spread quickly among the crew, and it was only a matter of time before management got involved. "I know," she said quietly, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't handle it well. Her supervisor held up a hand, stopping her. "I'm not here to reprimand you, not yet. But I want you to think about what happened. Really think about it. You've been a part of this team for years, Susan. You're good at what you do. But today, you let something cloud your judgment. And it wasn't just a bad day, it was something deeper. If you're willing, I'd like to suggest you take part in a new diversity and inclusion program we're rolling out. It's not mandatory, but I think it could help." Susan nodded, her throat tight. "I'll do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Over the next few weeks, Susan threw herself into the program. At first, she approached it as a box to check, a way to repair her reputation and move on. But as she sat through the sessions, listening to stories of people who had faced discrimination, hearing about the silent pain many carried every day, something began to shift. She saw herself in a new light, not as the victim of unfair scrutiny, but as someone who had contributed to the very problem she claimed to abhor. One particular session stayed with her. A guest speaker, a man not unlike John, shared his story of growing up in a world that constantly underestimated him because of his skin color. He spoke of the quiet pain of being overlooked, the exhaustion of having to prove himself over and over again, and the joy of finally finding success, not for validation, but for himself. Susan felt tears sting her eyes as she listened. She thought of John sitting there with his calm expression, enduring her dismissive attitude with more grace than she could have imagined. She thought of his parting words, "Treat everyone with respect, not because of who they might be, but because of who they are." Those words became a mantra for her. They echoed in her mind during every flight, every interaction with a passenger, every moment when she felt her patience tested. And slowly, they began to change her. Months later, Susan found herself speaking at a company event, something she never imagined she would do. She stood in front of a room filled with her colleagues, her hands gripping the edges of the podium as she shared her story. "I made a mistake," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "I made assumptions about someone based on nothing but appearances. I thought I was better than that. I thought I was above prejudice, but I wasn't. And it took someone showing me grace I didn't deserve, to help me see it." The room was silent, every eye on her. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I'm sharing this because I want you all to know that it's never too late to change. We all have blind spots. We all have biases we don't want to admit. But if we're willing to face them, to own up to them, we can do better. We can be better." As she stepped down from the podium, the room erupted in applause. Some of her colleagues stood, their expressions warm and encouraging. Susan felt a surge of relief, not because she had redeemed herself in their eyes, but because she had finally taken responsibility in her own. Later that evening, she sent John a letter. She didn't know if he would read it, but she needed to write it. In it, she thanked him for his grace, his patience, and his ability to see her not as the person she had been, but as the person she could become. A few months after the flight, John sat at his dining table, his young daughter perched on his lap as she giggled over a bedtime story. His phone buzzed, but he ignored it for a moment, savoring the joy of the moment. When the story was finished and his daughter toddled off to her room, he finally glanced at his phone. It was a message from the airline's corporate office. Attached was a video link labeled Employee Diversity Initiative, Susan's Testimony. Intrigued, John clicked on it, and what he saw surprised him. There she was, Susan, standing in front of a room full of employees, her hands clasped nervously, but her voice steady. She spoke about the mistakes she had made, about her initial reluctance to confront her biases, and about the moment that had changed everything. "I was wrong," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But more importantly, I was given the chance to make it right. That chance didn't come from anger or judgment. It came from someone who showed me grace when I didn't deserve it. That's what stayed with me. That's what pushed me to change. John leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He hadn't expected this, not from her. But as he watched the rest of the video, he realized that this wasn't just about Susan. This was about everyone in that room, everyone who would hear her story and reflect on their own behavior. The ripple effects of one small moment were spreading further than he could have imagined. Elsewhere, Susan was boarding another flight, this time as a passenger. She had taken some time off to visit family, a much-needed break after months of intense reflection and growth. As she settled into her seat, she noticed the man next to her watching something on his phone. The sound was faint but familiar. It was the same testimony video she had recorded. She smiled softly, her cheeks coloring with embarrassment as the man turned to her. "Hey, isn't that you?" he asked, tilting the screen toward her. She nodded, unsure of what to say. "I just saw this yesterday," he continued. "It made me think about a time I could have spoken up and didn't. You know, at work, when a colleague was being treated unfairly. After watching this, I went and apologized to him. It's funny how one story can make you see things differently, huh?" Susan felt a lump in her throat. "It really can," she said. "I'm glad it resonated with you." The man smiled. "More than that, it inspired me. Thanks for sharing your story." The beauty of stories like John's and Susan's is that they don't end when the credits roll. They continue, weaving their way into the lives of others, sparking new moments of kindness, understanding, and change. The person you choose to uplift today might uplift someone else tomorrow, and so the cycle continues. John didn't know how far the ripples of his quiet grace would reach, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had done the right thing, not for recognition, but because it was simply the right thing to do. And Susan? She wasn't perfect, but none of us are. What mattered was that she didn't let her mistakes define her. She chose to learn, to grow, and to become someone she could be proud of. That choice, that effort, was a testament to the power of humility and the belief that it's never too late to change. Now, let me ask you, what will your ripple be? How will your actions, your words, shape the lives of those around you? You may not think it matters, but trust me, it does. Every kind gesture, every moment of grace, every effort to listen and understand creates a ripple that can spread further than you'll ever know. Here, in this community, we believe in the power of those ripples. We believe in the power of stories to change hearts, minds, and lives. And if you're still here with us, it means you believe too. So join us, subscribe, and be part of something bigger. Because together, we're not just telling stories, we're creating a movement, one that spreads hope, love, and understanding in a world that needs it more than ever. Let's keep those ripples going, because the world doesn't change with grand gestures. It changes one small act of kindness at a time.